I arrived at my childhood home for Christmas dinner, nervous but excited to share life-changing news with my family. My girlfriend Sarah was 3 months pregnant, and I had been planning this announcement for weeks. The house felt different somehow, colder, more formal than usual. My mother Patricia greeted me with an unusual stiffness, and my father David seemed unusually quiet. I clutched a carefully wrapped gift box containing ultrasound photos and a heartfelt letter I wrote to my parents about becoming grandparents. I had no idea this would be the last normal moment of my relationship with my family. Walking through the front door of my childhood home, I breathed in the familiar scent of pine garland and cinnamon candles. The Christmas tree stood in its usual corner, decorated with ornaments I remembered hanging as a kid. But something felt off. The warmth I expected was missing, replaced by intention I could not quite identify. "Preston, you made it," my mother Patricia said, offering her cheek for the customary kiss. Her embrace lasted exactly 2 seconds before she stepped back, smoothing her perfectly pressed burgundy dress. At 58, she maintained the same rigid posture that had intimidated me throughout childhood. My father David emerged from his study, reading glasses perched on his nose, wearing the navy blazer he reserved for special occasions. At 62, he still carried himself like the successful businessman he once was, though retirement had softened his edges slightly. "Son," he nodded, shaking my hand with less enthusiasm than usual. "Where is Amanda?" I asked, looking around for my younger sister. "She will be down shortly," Patricia replied, straightening already perfect silverware on the dining room table. "She is finishing her phone call with Thomas about their wedding plans." I'd forgotten about Amanda's engagement to Thomas Bradley, announced just 2 months ago. My 25-year-old sister had always been the responsible one, following the path our parents expected. Law school, then a prestigious firm, now marrying another lawyer from an approved family. The dining room had been transformed for the occasion. Patricia's finest china gleamed under the crystal chandelier, and red poinsettias created centerpieces between silver candlesticks. Everything appeared flawless, orchestrated with the precision that defined my mother's approach to life. Amanda finally appeared, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat chignon, wearing a green silk blouse that complemented her fair complexion. "Sorry, Preston," she said, hugging me briefly. "Thomas sends his regards. He could not make it because his family gathering ran long." We took our seats at the mahogany table that had hosted countless family meals. Patricia had prepared her traditional Christmas feast, honey-glazed ham-roasted turkey with sage stuffing sweet potato casserole topped with marshmallows and green bean almondine. The spread was magnificent, yet the conversation felt stilted. "How is teaching treating you?" David asked, cutting into his ham with deliberate precision. "Really well," I replied, grateful for the opening. "The kids at Jefferson High have been incredible this semester. We just finished our unit on American literature, and some of their essays about social justice movements genuinely moved me." Patricia's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "Social justice?" She repeated, her tone suggesting distaste. "I hope you are not filling their heads with radical ideas. I am teaching them to think critically about literature and its connection to society," I said carefully. "Authors like Harper Lee and John Steinbeck wrote about real issues that still matter today." "Well," Patricia said, dabbing her lips with her napkin, "at least you have steady employment, even if it is not what we hoped for you." The familiar sting of her disapproval hit me, but I pushed it aside. Tonight was about sharing good news about expanding our family in the most wonderful way possible. I reached for the wrapped gift box beside my chair, my heart racing with anticipation. "Actually, I began, my voice stronger than I felt. "I have something important to tell everyone. Sarah and I have some news that will change everything." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Amanda stopped chewing. David set down his wine glass, and Patricia's back became even straighter than usual. "Sarah is pregnant," I announced, unable to contain my smile. "We are going to have a baby. You are going to be grandparents." The silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Patricia's face slowly turned the color of the cranberry sauce, while David stared at his plate as if it contained fascinating hieroglyphics. Pregnant, Patricia said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Yes. I continued, mistaking her shock for the need for details. We are about 12 weeks along. The doctor says everything looks perfect. Sarah is absolutely glowing, and we could not be happier. We know it is earlier than we planned to get married, but we want this baby so much. We want you to be part of this incredible journey. Amanda shifted uncomfortably in her chair, shooting worried glances between our parents and me. The joy I had expected to see was nowhere to be found. How could you be so irresponsible? Patricia's voice erupted like a volcano. How could you throw away everything we have given you for some little gold-digging tramp? The words hit me like physical blows. Sarah is not a gold digger, I said, my voice shaking. She is an amazing woman who works 2 jobs to put herself through nursing school. She does not even know about the family money. Oh, please, Patricia laughed bitterly. They always know. Women like her can smell money from miles away. She trapped you with this pregnancy, and now she expects to cash in. That is not true, I protested, but Patricia was just getting started. I will not have some bastard child ruining this family's reputation. She declared, her words cutting through the air like shards of glass. I will not watch you destroy your future for a moment of poor judgment. David finally spoke, his voice heavy with resignation. Patricia and I have discussed this possibility. We cannot support this relationship or any children that might result from it. I stared at my father in disbelief. You discussed this? You planned what you would say if I got Sarah pregnant? We had hoped you would come to your senses before it reached this point, Patricia said coldly. But since you have chosen this path, you have also chosen to remove yourself from this family's future. The room began to spin slightly. What do you mean? I mean you are no longer in the will, Patricia announced with surgical precision. I mean if you proceed with this ridiculous relationship and this illegitimate child, you are dead to me. I will not have my family's legacy tainted by your poor choices. Amanda finally found her voice. Mom, that is extreme. Preston is your son. Preston was my son, Patricia corrected. Now he is a stranger who happens to share my last name. I felt like I was drowning in the formal dining room, where I had celebrated every birthday, every achievement, every milestone of my life. The people who had raised me, who had taught me about love and family, were looking at me like I had committed an unforgivable crime. The gift box sat forgotten on the table between us, wrapped in silver paper with a red velvet bow that Sarah had tied herself. Inside were ultrasound photos of our baby, barely visible but already beloved. There was also a letter I had written pouring out my heart about how excited I was to become a father, how much I hoped my parents would love their grandchild the way they had loved me and Amanda. Standing up slowly, I placed the gift deliberately in the center of the table, between the untouched sweet potatoes and the rapidly cooling turkey. This contains something you need to see before making any permanent decisions, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. Open it whenever you're ready to learn the truth. Patricia glared at the innocent package as if it might explode. I do not want anything from you. Then do not open it, I replied, walking toward the front door. But if you ever wonder whether you made the right choice tonight, that box has your answer. As I reached for my coat, hanging on the same hook I had used since elementary school, I heard Patricia's curiosity overcome her anger. The sound of tearing paper filled the silence behind me. Then came the scream. It started low like air escaping from a balloon, then rose to a piercing wail that made Amanda cry out in alarm. I turned to see my mother's face completely white, her hands shaking as she stared into the open box. Where did you get this? She whispered, her voice broken and small. But I was already walking out the door, leaving behind the family that had chosen money and pride over love, not knowing that the truth inside that box would change everything. The drive back to my apartment should have taken 20 minutes, but I found myself pulling into the parking lot of Lincoln Park instead. Snow was beginning to fall, dusting the empty playground where I'd spent countless afternoons as a child. I sat in my car engine running for warmth, trying to process what had just happened. My phone buzzed constantly with calls from Amanda, but I could not bring myself to answer. The baby who should have brought joy to our family had instead torn it apart before even being born. Sarah would be devastated when I told her about my parents' reaction. After an hour of sitting in the growing darkness, I finally drove home to our modest apartment on Maple Street. Sarah met me at the door, her auburn hair falling in waves around her shoulders, wearing the soft blue sweater that made her green eyes sparkle. Her face lit up with anticipation until she saw my expression. "How did they take the news?" she asked, her hand instinctively moving to her still flat stomach. I could not find words to explain the complete disaster the evening had become. Instead, I pulled her close, breathing, in the lavender scent of her shampoo, trying to find comfort in her warmth. "That bad," she whispered against my chest. "Worse than I imagined possible," I admitted. Before I could explain further, my phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen, and something in my chest loosened slightly. Maybe he had talked sense into my mother. Maybe there was still hope for our family. "Preston," his voice sounded strained, tired. "You need to come back. There are things you need to know about that gift you left." "I am not subjecting Sarah to any more of Mom's cruelty," I said firmly. "Come alone then, please. What your mother found in that box changes everything." Against my better judgment, I kissed Sarah goodbye and drove back through the falling snow to my childhood home. The house looked different somehow, less imposing in the white landscape. David met me at the door, his face grave. "She is in the study," he said quietly. "She has been crying for 2 hours." I found Patricia sitting behind David's massive oak desk, surrounded by scattered papers and photographs. Her perfectly styled hair hung loose around her shoulders, and her makeup was streaked with tears. In her hands, she held a manila folder thick with documents. "Sit down," she said without looking up. I remained standing, unsure what new attack was coming. 3 months ago, I hired a private investigator named Marcus Webb. She began, her voice hollow. "The moment you started talking seriously about Sarah, I knew I needed to know everything about her background." My stomach clenched. "You had Sarah investigated." "I had to protect you," Patricia said, finally meeting my eyes. "I had to know what kind of person was trying to enter our family." She opened the folder, revealing page after page of typed reports, photographs, and official documents. My girlfriend's entire life had been dissected and analyzed by strangers. "Sarah Mitchell was born in Columbus, Ohio," Patricia read in a monotone voice. "Only child of Robert and Linda Mitchell, both deceased in a car accident when she was 17. She married Jake Morrison at 19, divorced him 2 years later, citing domestic violence. She spent 6 months in a women's shelter before moving to Chicago to attend nursing school." Each word felt like a betrayal of Sarah's trust, even though she had told me most of these details herself over the course of our relationship. But hearing them read like a criminal profile made my skin crawl. "She currently works as a nurse's aide at General Hospital. While pursuing her bachelor's degree," Patricia continued, "she also works part-time at a women's clinic downtown. She has $43,000 in student loan debt and lives in a studio apartment before moving in with you." "So what?" I snapped. "She is hardworking and independent. She survived losing her parents and escaping an abusive marriage. That makes her strong, not damaged." Patricia's hands trembled as she turned to another section of the report. "The investigator spoke to her ex-husband." My blood ran cold. Sarah had told me Jake Morrison was dangerous, that he had threatened her when she left. The idea of a stranger contacting him made me sick. "What did he say?" I asked, dreading the answer. "He called her a liar and a manipulator." Patricia said quietly. He claims she made up the abuse allegations to get a better divorce settlement. He says she is calculating and always looking for her next mark. And you believe him? I asked incredulously. You believe an abuser over your son's judgment? For the first time since I had returned, Patricia looked directly at me. I did not know what to believe. I only knew that you were making decisions that could affect our entire family based on emotions rather than facts. Amanda appeared in the doorway, her face puffy from crying. Preston, I'm so sorry. I had no idea they were doing this. Did you know she was trying to control your life, too? I asked my sister. Amanda glanced nervously at Patricia before answering. What do you mean? Does she approve of Thomas? Or did she investigate him as well? Patricia's silence was answer enough. Amanda sank into the leather chair beside the desk, realization dawning on her face. Oh my God, Amanda whispered. The questions you asked about his family, about his background. You investigated Thomas too. I investigated everyone who might become part of this family, Patricia admitted. It is my responsibility to protect what we have built. What we have built is supposed to be love, I said, my voice rising. Not some fortress designed to keep out anyone who does not meet your arbitrary standards. David, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke from his position by the window. Show him the rest, Patricia. There is more, I asked. Patricia reached for another section of the folder, her movements slow and reluctant. The investigator found records from the women's shelter where Sarah stayed. He spoke to the counselors who worked with her. She pulled out a series of photographs that made my heart stop. They showed Sarah 2.5 years ago, her face bruised and swollen, her left arm in a cast. The young woman in those pictures looked nothing like the confident, radiant person I knew. The medical records confirm multiple injuries consistent with domestic violence. Patricia read, her voice barely above a whisper. Broken ribs, a fractured wrist, contusions across her back and shoulders. The shelter's intake notes describe her as severely traumatized but determined to rebuild her life. I stared at the evidence of what Sarah had endured, feeling sick that strangers had invaded her most private trauma for my mother's peace of mind. The counselor's report describes her as one of the most resilient survivors they had ever worked with, Patricia continued. She volunteered to help other women while she was still healing from her own injuries. She tutored children at the shelter and organized support groups for other residents. So she is exactly who I told you she was, I said, struggling to control my emotions. A strong, compassionate woman who has overcome incredible challenges. The investigator also found this, Patricia said, producing a newspaper clipping from 2 years ago. The headline read, Local Nursing Student Helps Launch Support Program for Young Mothers. The article featured a photograph of Sarah speaking at a community event, her face bright with purpose, as she addressed a crowd of women and children. The caption identified her as a volunteer coordinator for a program helping single mothers complete their education while receiving childcare and counseling services. She never told you about this work? Patricia asked. I stared at the newspaper clipping, realizing there were depths to Sarah's character I was still discovering. She mentioned volunteering but never went into detail. She does not like to talk about herself. According to the investigator, she has been instrumental in helping dozens of women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives, David said from his position by the window. The program she helped create has expanded to 3 other cities. The revelation hung in the air between us. My mother had hired someone to destroy Sarah's reputation, and instead the investigation had revealed a young woman of extraordinary character and compassion. So you know she is a good person, I said finally. You know she loves me for who I am, not what my family has. Why are you still trying to destroy our relationship? Patricia was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photographs and documents spread across the desk. When she finally spoke, her voice was thick with emotion. Because she reminds me of someone I failed to protect a long time ago. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Patricia's composed mask had completely cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable underneath. David moved closer to his wife, placing a protective hand on her shoulder. "What do you mean?" I asked, settling into the chair across from the desk. Patricia gathered the scattered papers with shaking hands, organizing them into neat piles as if creating order from the chaos of documents could somehow organize her emotions as well. "When I was 22, I had a younger sister named Julia," she began, her voice barely audible. "She was beautiful-spirited, everything I was not. While I was focused on building a respectable life, Julia fell in love with a man our parents disapproved of." I glanced at Amanda, who looked as surprised by this revelation as I felt. In all my years, I had never heard Patricia mention a sister. "His name was Richard Morrison," Patricia continued. "He was charming, handsome, from a working-class family in Cleveland. Our parents forbade the relationship, threatened to cut Julia off financially if she continued seeing him." The name Morrison sent a chill through me. Sarah's ex-husband was Jake Morrison. Julia married him anyway. Patricia said, tears beginning to flow freely down her cheeks. "Our parents made good on their threat. They disowned her completely, told everyone she was dead to them. I was young, scared, and I followed their lead instead of standing up for my sister." David's grip on Patricia's shoulder tightened as she struggled to continue her story. "For 2 years, I had no contact with Julia. I heard rumors through mutual friends that she was struggling, that Richard had changed after the marriage. But I was too proud, too angry that she had chosen him over family to reach out." Amanda leaned forward in her chair. "What happened to her?" "She tried to come home," Patricia whispered. "She showed up at our parents' house one winter night, bruised and pregnant, begging for help. She said Richard had become violent, controlling, and she was afraid for her life and the baby's life." The parallel to Sarah's story was becoming painfully clear. "Our father turned her away," Patricia said, her voice breaking completely. "He said she had made her choice and would have to live with the consequences. He said he would not enable her poor judgment by rescuing her from the bed she had made." I felt sick imagining a frightened pregnant woman being turned away by her own family. 3 months later, we got the call, Patricia continued. Julia was dead. Richard had beaten her to death during an argument. The baby died too. The room fell completely silent except for the sound of Patricia's quiet sobbing. Years of grief and guilt poured out in those tears, decades of carrying the weight of a decision that could never be undone. I swore I would never let anyone else make the same mistake Julia made, Patricia said, looking directly at me. I swore I would protect the people I love from getting involved with the wrong person, even if it meant being seen as controlling or cruel. But Sarah is not Julia, I said gently, and I am not you. The situations are completely different. Are they? Patricia asked, her eyes blazing with renewed intensity. Sarah was married to a Morrison. She comes from nothing, just like Julia's husband. She is pregnant with your child just like Julia was. How do I know this story will not end the same way? Because Jake Morrison is Sarah's ex-husband, not her current one, I said firmly. Because she left him when he became abusive, which is exactly what Julia should have been able to do if her family had supported her instead of abandoning her. David cleared his throat, drawing our attention. There is something else, Patricia. Something you need to tell him. Patricia looked at her husband with panic in her eyes, shaking her head slightly. Tell me what, I demanded. David sat down heavily in the chair beside Amanda. Your mother has been making substantial donations to domestic violence organizations for the past 20 years. She has given over $200,000 to shelters, legal aid programs, and counseling services for abuse survivors. This revelation hit me like a physical blow. My mother, who seemed so cold and controlling, had been quietly funding the exact kind of help that Sarah had needed to escape her dangerous marriage. The largest recipient of her donations has been the Julia Morrison Foundation, David continued. It is named after her sister and provides comprehensive services to young women trying to leave abusive relationships. I stared at Patricia in amazement. You have been helping women like Sarah for 20 years. It was the least I could do, she said, wiping her eyes with a tissue. Money could not bring Julia back, but maybe it could save someone else's sister, someone else's daughter. The irony was overwhelming. My mother had spent decades trying to undo the damage caused by her family's rejection of Julia, yet she was repeating the same pattern with Sarah. Do you not see the contradiction? I asked. You honor Julia's memory by helping abuse survivors, then you attack the abuse survivor your son loves. Patricia stared at me for a long moment, then turned her attention to the gift box that still sat open on the desk. What was in that package you left David said it would change everything. For the first time since returning to the house, I smiled. Ultrasound photos of your grandchild, and a letter explaining how working with domestic violence survivors has made me the man I am today. Patricia's face went white. What do you mean working with survivors? I volunteer at the Julia Morrison Foundation, I said, watching shock register on her face. I have been helping women rebuild their lives for the past 2 years. That is how I met Sarah. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia gripped the edge of the desk as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. You work at Julia's Foundation? I teach literacy classes and help with job placement programs, I explained. Sarah was one of the success stories. She came in scared and broken, but she had incredible determination to build a better life. I watched her transform from a victim into a survivor, then from a survivor into someone who helps other women find their own strength. Amanda leaned forward, her eyes wide with realization. That is how you two met at the foundation. Sarah was volunteering there while finishing nursing school, I continued. She ran support groups for pregnant women trying to leave abusive relationships. I admired her strength, her compassion, her commitment to helping others, even while she was still healing from her own trauma. Patricia suddenly stood up, moving to the window that overlooked the snow-covered garden where Julia used to play as a child. All this time, she whispered, I thought I was protecting you from making Julia's mistake. But you were already honoring her memory in the most beautiful way possible. David joined his wife at the window, wrapping his arms around her trembling shoulders. Sarah is not the threat to our family, Patricia. She is the proof that Julia's death meant something, that the foundation you built in her name actually works. I looked around the study where my father had taught me to read, where Patricia had helped me with homework, where we had celebrated my acceptance to college. The family that had shaped me was finally seeing who I had become. There is one more thing you should know, I said quietly. Sarah is getting her master's degree in social work. Her thesis project is developing better intervention programs for pregnant women in abusive relationships. She wants to make sure no woman ever faces the choice Julia had to make. Patricia turned from the window, tears streaming down her face. She is going to save women like my sister. She already has saved women like your sister, I said. The question is whether you want to be part of that legacy or repeat the mistakes that cost Julia her life. Patricia walked slowly back to the desk, picking up one of the ultrasound photos from the open gift box. The tiny form of her grandchild was barely visible, but the image represented infinite possibility. I have been so afraid of losing you the way I lost Julia, she said softly. But I was about to lose you by making the same choice my parents made. You have not lost me, I said, standing to face her. But you need to decide who you want to be. The woman who honors Julia's memory by supporting love and family, or the woman who repeats the mistakes that killed her sister. Patricia looked at the ultrasound photo for a long moment, then at the newspaper clipping showing Sarah's work with young mothers. Finally, she looked at me, her son, who had found purpose in continuing Julia's fight. I want to meet her, Patricia said quietly. I want to meet the woman who is carrying my grandchild and continuing my sister's work. I want to tell her about Julia, and I want to ask her forgiveness for the terrible things I said tonight. Amanda clapped her hands together, tears of relief shining in her eyes. David smiled for the first time all evening, and I felt the family I thought I had lost beginning to heal. The snowfall had intensified by the time I called Sarah from my parents' driveway, and I could hear the exhaustion in her voice when she answered. "How are you feeling?" I asked, knowing the pregnancy had been making her more tired than usual. "Better now that you called," she said softly. "I've been worried about you." "How did the second conversation go?" "Much better than the first," I said, watching the warm glow from the study window, where my family was still processing everything we had discussed. "Actually, they want to meet you properly. Would you be willing to come over tomorrow?" There was a pause before Sarah responded. "Are you sure that is a good idea? I do not want to make things worse between you and your family." "Trust me," I said. "Tomorrow is going to be very different from tonight." When I returned to the study, I found Patricia carefully reading through the investigator's report again, but this time her expression was thoughtful rather than judgmental. "I owe that young woman an enormous apology," she said without looking up. "The things I said tonight were unforgivable." "Sarah is more understanding than you deserve," I replied honestly. "But she believes in redemption and second chances. It is part of what makes her special." David had been unusually quiet during our emotional revelations, but now he cleared his throat with the hesitant manner that usually preceded important announcements. "There is something else we need to discuss, Juana," he said, glancing at Patricia for permission to continue. "Something about the foundation that you do not know." I settled back into my chair, unsure what other surprises this evening might hold. "Your mother's donations to the Julia Morrison Foundation have not been anonymous," David began carefully. "For the past 5 years, she has been serving on their board of directors under her maiden name Patricia Williams." This revelation stunned me into silence. My mother had been actively involved with the organization where I volunteered, and neither of us had known about the other's involvement. "You have been on the board?" I asked, struggling to process this information. Patricia nodded, looking embarrassed. "I wanted to make sure the money was being used effectively. I started by just reviewing financial reports, but gradually became more involved in program development and policy decisions." "The literacy program you teach," David continued, "was actually Patricia's idea. She proposed it after reading about the number of women who struggled to find employment because of limited education." I stared at my mother with new understanding. "You created the program I have been volunteering with." "I created it because of what I learned about Julia's struggles," Patricia explained. "The police reports from her death mentioned that she had tried to get a job to support herself independently, but she lacked the basic skills necessary for most positions. If she had been able to achieve financial independence, she might have been able to leave Richard sooner." Amanda looked back and forth between us with amazement. "So Preston has been carrying out Mom's vision without either of you knowing it?" "It appears that way," David said with a slight smile. "But there is more." Patricia opened another section of the investigator's report, revealing photographs from various foundation events and fundraisers. In several of the pictures, I could see myself in the background, helping with registration tables or setting up chairs for presentations. "Marcus Webb documented your volunteer activities as part of his investigation into your character," Patricia explained. "He was trying to determine whether you were genuinely committed to service or just trying to impress Sarah by volunteering where she worked. One photograph showed me reading to a group of children while their mothers attended a job skills workshop. Another captured me helping an elderly woman fill out employment applications. A third showed me presenting certificates to graduates of the literacy program. His report concludes that your commitment to the foundation appears genuine and long-standing," Patricia read. "He notes that other volunteers describe you as reliable, compassionate, and particularly effective with participants who struggle with confidence issues. You had me investigated, too." I asked, though I was more amused than angry at this point. I had to understand whether this volunteer work was really who you are or just something you were doing to win Sarah's approval, Patricia admitted. I needed to know if my son had truly become the kind of man who would honor his aunt's memory. David produced another folder from the desk drawer, this one considerably thicker than the first. This contains Marcus Webb's complete report on your activities, your relationship with Sarah, and your work at the foundation. I opened the folder to find detailed documentation of my life over the past year. There were photographs of Sarah and me at the grocery store at the park having coffee at our favorite cafe. There were transcripts of conversations with my principal at Jefferson High, my colleagues at the foundation, even the owner of the small restaurant where Sarah and I had our first date. This is incredibly invasive, I said, flipping through pages of intimate details about my private life. It was necessary, Patricia said firmly, but reading through it has shown me that everything you told me about Sarah is true. More than that, it has shown me that you have become exactly the kind of man Julia would have wanted her nephew to be. I stopped reading and looked up at her. Her nephew... Patricia's expression grew tender as she reached for a small silver frame that had been hidden beneath the other papers. Julia was carrying a son when she died. She had picked out the name Preston. The frame contained a faded photograph of a young woman who looked remarkably like Amanda, with dark hair and bright eyes full of mischief and joy. She was laughing at something beyond the camera's view, her hands resting protectively over her pregnant belly. "You named me after the baby who died with Julia," I asked, my voice thick with emotion. "Your father and I could not have children for several years after we married," Patricia explained. "When I finally became pregnant with you, I felt like Julia was giving me the chance to raise the son she never could. Naming you Preston was my way of keeping her memory alive." David leaned forward, adding his own piece to this puzzle of family history. "What your mother has not told you is that she established the Julia Morrison Foundation on the anniversary of Preston's death. Every program, every service, every woman who has been helped through that organization represents her attempt to give Julia's son the life he never had the chance to live. The weight of this legacy settled around me like a warm blanket. I had been unknowingly fulfilling my mother's deepest wishes, honoring the memory of a sister and nephew I had never known existed. Sarah is not a threat to Julia's legacy," I said, understanding, finally dawning. "She is the living proof that Julia's death was not meaningless." Patricia picked up the ultrasound photo again, studying the tiny form with new eyes. "This baby represents everything Julia died trying to protect. A chance for love to triumph over violence, for family to support, rather than abandon for the future to be better than the past." Amanda wiped tears from her eyes as she looked at the photograph of the aunt she had never known. "Julia looks like she would have been an amazing mother." "She would have been," Patricia agreed. "But maybe her spirit lives on in the work Sarah does in the women who escape because of the foundation's help, in the children who grow up safe, because their mothers found the courage to leave." I thought about all the women I had worked with at the foundation, all the success stories that had given me hope about human resilience and the power of community support. Sarah's story was just one among hundreds, but each one represented a life that Julia's death had helped save. "There is one more thing," David said, producing a legal document from the bottom of the folder. "This is why I have been so quiet tonight, why I let Patricia express her fears before revealing everything we knew." The document was titled Amendment to Family Trust: Emergency Provisions for Domestic Violence Survivors. As I read through the legal language, I realized what I was looking at. "You restructured the family trust to provide emergency funding for women leaving abusive relationships?" I asked. "We restructured it to provide emergency funding for women, helped by organizations like the Julia Morrison Foundation," David corrected. "The trust now includes provisions for education scholarships, legal aid, temporary housing, and childcare assistance." Patricia stood up and walked to the window again, looking out at the snow-covered garden where Julia had once played. "When I threatened to remove you from the will tonight, I was lying. The truth is, I have been restructuring our entire financial legacy to ensure it serves Julia's memory. Instead of just leaving money to our children, We are creating a perpetual fund that will help women like Sarah build new lives for themselves and their children, David explained. Your inheritance will come in the form of managing and directing that fund. I stared at the legal documents, understanding that my parents had been planning this transformation of our family's wealth for months, possibly years. So when you said I was out of the will, I said slowly, what you really meant was that I was about to inherit a much greater responsibility. I meant that if you walked away from Sarah and our grandchild, you would be walking away from the chance to honor Julia's memory in the most meaningful way possible, Patricia said. I was testing whether you understood what family really means. The irony was not lost on me. In trying to protect Sarah and our baby from my family's rejection, I had nearly missed the opportunity to help them become part of something much larger and more meaningful than I had ever imagined. David had remained standing by the window throughout most of our emotional revelations, but now he moved to the chair behind his desk with the deliberate movements of a man preparing to unburden himself of long-held secrets. I need to tell you something about my role in tonight's events. He began, his voice heavy with shame. Something that will help you understand why I stayed silent when your mother said those terrible things. I looked at my father, this man who had always seemed like a pillar of strength and integrity, and saw something broken in his expression. I knew about the investigation into Sarah, he admitted. Not only did I know about it, I suggested it. The admission hit me like cold water. You wanted Mom to have Sarah investigated. I was terrified, David said simply. Not of Sarah herself, but of what loving her might cost you. I have watched your mother carry the guilt of Julia's death for 25 years, and I could not bear the thought of you facing a similar loss. Patricia turned from the window, surprise evident on her face. David, you do not need to. Yes, I do. He interrupted gently but firmly. Preston deserves to know the truth about both of his parents, not just his mother's fears. David opened the bottom drawer of his desk and withdrew a thick photo album bound in worn leather. This belonged to Julia, he said, placing it carefully on the desk between us. Patricia has never been able to look through it, but I have studied every page, trying to understand how we could have prevented her death. I opened the album to find photographs spanning Julia's short life. There were pictures of her as a laughing child, as a teenager in a prom dress, as a young woman in love. The final pages showed her with Richard Morrison, and I could see the gradual change in her expression from joy to worry to fear. Julia kept detailed journals. David continued producing a small stack of notebooks from the same drawer. She documented Richard's increasing jealousy, his attempts to isolate her from friends and family, his escalating verbal and physical abuse. I picked up one of the journals and read Julia's careful handwriting describing an incident where Richard had thrown a plate at her head for talking to a neighbor. Her words conveyed both terror and a desperate hope that things would improve. The most heartbreaking entries are from her final weeks, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. She wrote about her pregnancy with such joy, such plans for the future. She believed becoming a father would help Richard control his anger. Amanda leaned over to look at the journal in my hands, tears streaming down her face as she read her aunt's words of hope and fear. Julia's final entry was written the day before she tried to come home, David continued. She wrote that she was scared for her baby's life, that Richard had threatened to kill both of them if she ever tried to leave. But she also wrote that she believed her family would protect her if she could just find the courage to ask for help. The weight of that betrayed trust filled the room like smoke. Julia had died believing her family would save her if she could just reach them. When Patricia told me about your relationship with Sarah, I immediately thought about Julia's journals, David admitted. I became obsessed with the idea that history was repeating itself, that we were going to lose you the same way we lost Julia. But Sarah had already left her abusive husband, I protested. She had already proven she was strong enough to save herself. I know that now, David said. but fear makes people irrational. I convinced myself that Jake Morrison might come after her, that being involved with her might put you in danger. I suggested hiring Marcus Webb not to investigate Sarah's character, but to assess the threat level from her ex-husband. This revelation cast the entire investigation in a different light. My parents had not been trying to prove Sarah was unworthy. They had been trying to determine whether loving her might get me killed. What did the investigator find out about Jake Morrison? I asked. David reached for another section of the report, this one marked Subject's Former Spouse Threat Assessment. Jake Morrison is currently serving a 3-year sentence for assault and battery against his second wife, he read. He has been incarcerated for 18 months with no possibility of early release. Relief flooded through me. So Sarah is safe from him. She has been safe for over a year, David confirmed. But I was so consumed with protecting you that I did not share this information with your mother until tonight. I let her believe Sarah was still in potential danger, which fed into her fears about repeating Julia's tragedy. Patricia returned to her seat, looking at her husband with a mixture of love and exasperation. You have been carrying this fear alone for months. I have been carrying it alone for 25 years, David replied. Ever since the night I convinced our parents that Julia had made her choice and should live with the consequences. This confession stunned everyone into silence. Patricia stared at her husband as if seeing him for the first time. You were there that night, she asked. I was there. David nodded, his voice breaking. Julia came to the door around midnight, bruised and terrified, begging for help. Your father was ready to turn her away, but your mother was wavering. She wanted to let Julia stay to protect her grandchild. I could barely breathe as I imagined that crucial moment when Julia's fate hung in the balance. Your mother looked at me for support, David continued. She trusted my judgment, valued my opinion. If I had spoken up for Julia, if I had argued for compassion over pride, your parents might have listened. What did you say? Amanda whispered. I said that helping Julia would only enable her to make more poor choices. David admitted, his face crumbling with shame. I said that rescuing her would prevent her from learning to stand on her own. I said that sometimes love means letting people face the consequences of their actions. Patricia reached for her husband's hand, understanding flooding her face. You have blamed yourself for Julia's death all these years. I killed her as surely as if I had thrown the punches myself, David said. My words convinced your parents to turn her away. My advice sent her back to Richard Morrison to die. The room fell silent except for the sound of David's quiet sobbing. This strong, dignified man who had raised me to believe in justice and compassion had been living with the knowledge that his own failure of compassion had cost an innocent woman her life. That is why you stayed quiet tonight, I said, understanding finally dawning. You were afraid of giving bad advice again. I was paralyzed, David agreed. Every instinct told me to support you and Sarah, but I could not trust my own judgment. What if I was wrong again? What if my advice led to another tragedy? I looked at this broken man who had shaped my moral compass, who had taught me the importance of standing up for what is right. Dad, you were 24 years old when Julia died. You made a mistake born of inexperience and social pressure, not malice. A mistake that cost 2 lives, David replied. A mistake that has motivated you to spend the past 25 years trying to save other lives, Patricia corrected gently. David, you have been the Foundation's most dedicated board member. You have personally reviewed every application for emergency aid, approved funding for hundreds of women in crisis situations. She was right. The investigator's report had mentioned David's involvement with the Foundation, but I had not understood the depth of his commitment. Every woman we have helped represents David's attempt to save Julia, Patricia continued. Every child who grows up safe because we provided their mother with emergency housing represents his effort to save Julia's baby. I thought about all the foundation events I had attended, all the success stories I had witnessed. David had been present at every celebration, every graduation, every moment when a woman achieved independence and safety. Sarah was one of the women you approved for emergency assistance, I realized. David nodded, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. When her application came across my desk 2 years ago, I saw so much of Julia in her story. Young, pregnant, trapped with a violent man desperate for a chance to build a better life. You helped save her before I even met her. I helped provide her with the resources she needed to save herself, David corrected. Just like I should have helped Julia save herself 25 years ago. Patricia stood up and walked around the desk to embrace her husband. You cannot change what happened to Julia, but look at what your guilt has accomplished. Look at the lives you have saved, the families you have protected. Amanda joined the embrace, and after a moment's hesitation, so did I. This imperfect family, bound together by love and loss, and the determination to do better than previous generations, was exactly what Sarah and our baby needed. Tomorrow, when Sarah comes to meet us properly, I said, you need to tell her about the Foundation's role in her life. She deserves to know that the family she is joining has been protecting her long before she knew we existed. David looked up at me with gratitude and relief. Do you think she can forgive us for tonight? For the things we said and the fears we let control us? I think Sarah understands better than anyone how fear and trauma can make people act in ways that contradict their true nature, I replied. She has spent years helping people overcome their worst moments and find their way back to love. Then tomorrow we start over, Patricia said firmly. Tomorrow we welcome her into this family and into Julia's legacy properly. As we finally prepared to leave the study, David stopped me at the door. Preston, there is one more thing you should know about Sarah's application for emergency assistance. I turned back to face him. She specifically requested to be placed in our program rather than others that offered higher financial benefits, he said. When asked why she wrote that she had heard the Julia Morrison Foundation was started by a family who understood loss, and she wanted to be helped by people who would not judge her for the mistakes she had made in love, the perfect circle of this revelation took my breath away. Sarah had chosen to be helped by my family because she sensed we would understand her pain. Now she was about to become part of the family in the most beautiful way possible. She was already one of us, I said softly. We just did not know it yet. I drove home through the snow-covered streets with my mind reeling from the evening's revelations. Sarah was awake when I arrived, sitting at our small kitchen table with a cup of herbal tea, and her social work textbooks spread around her. You look like you have seen a ghost, she said, setting down her highlighter and studying my face. Several ghosts, actually, I replied, sinking into the chair across from her. Sarah, there are things about my family that I need to tell you. Things that will help you understand what happened tonight and why tomorrow is going to be completely different. Over the next hour, I shared everything I had learned about Julia's story, Patricia's guilt, David's involvement with the foundation, and the incredible web of connections that had brought Sarah into our lives long before we met. Sarah listened without interruption, her green eyes growing wider with each revelation. When I finished, she sat quietly for several minutes processing the magnitude of what I told her. Your family has been supporting women like me for 25 years because of your aunt's death, she asked finally. More than supporting, I said. They have been trying to rewrite Julia's ending through every woman they help. And tomorrow, they want to meet the woman who represents everything they hope to achieve. Sarah stood up and walked to our kitchen window, looking out at the falling snow. I knew there was something familiar about the Foundation's approach when I first contacted them, she said thoughtfully. They seemed to understand trauma in a way that felt personal, not clinical. David approved your emergency assistance application personally, I told her. He says you reminded him of Julia. The Foundation's emergency fund paid for my first semester of nursing school, Sarah said quietly. Without that support, I would never have been able to afford the prerequisites for my program. I joined her at the window, wrapping my arms around her from behind and resting my hands on the slight curve of her belly where our baby was growing. My family has been protecting you and our child before they even knew you existed, I said. Tomorrow they want the chance to do it properly. Sarah leaned back against my chest and I felt some of the tension leave her shoulders. What if I say the wrong thing? What if I remind your mother too much of Julia's tragedy? Then you remind her that this story gets to have a different ending, I replied. Julia's story ends with death, but yours ends with life, with love, with a family that will support you instead of abandoning you. The next morning dawned clear and bright, the overnight snow having transformed the city into a winter wonderland. Sarah spent extra time getting ready, choosing a soft blue dress that complemented her eyes and made her pregnancy glow more noticeable. Are you nervous? I asked as we drove to my parents' house. Terrified, she admitted, but also hopeful. If everything you told me is true, then your family and I have more in common than they realize. Patricia answered the door before we even rang the bell, as if she had been watching for our arrival. She looked softer somehow, wearing a simple gray sweater instead of her usual formal attire, her hair pulled back in a gentle ponytail rather than her typical rigid style. Sarah, she said, her voice trembling slightly, thank you for coming. I know after last night you would have every right to refuse to see us again. Mrs. Hayes, Sarah replied graciously. Preston explained about Julia. I understand why you were protecting your family. Patricia's eyes filled with tears at the mention of her sister's name. Would you like to see her picture? I have been carrying her memory alone for so long. But I think it is time to share her with the people she would have loved. We settled in the living room where David and Amanda were waiting with photo albums and documents spread across the coffee table. Patricia produced the silver frame containing Julia's picture and placed it carefully in Sarah's hands. Sarah studied the photograph with intense concentration, and I watched emotions play across her face as she absorbed Julia's youthful beauty and the protective way her hands rested on her pregnant belly. She looks happy in this picture, Sarah observed. She looks like she was excited about being a mother. She was, Patricia said softly. Even with everything that was happening with Richard, she was so hopeful about the baby. She had already picked out names, bought tiny clothes, written letters to her unborn child. Sarah's eyes grew bright with unshed tears. I have been doing the same things. Writing letters, imagining the future, believing that love can overcome any obstacle. The difference is that you have a family who will support that love, David said, speaking for the first time. Julia died because we failed her. You will live because we refuse to fail again. Amanda, who had been unusually quiet, suddenly spoke up. Sarah, can I ask you something about your work at the foundation? Of course. Do you remember a young woman named Carmen Rodriguez who came through the program about 6 months ago? She was pregnant and had been hiding the pregnancy from her abusive boyfriend. Sarah's face lit up with recognition. Carmen, yes. She was one of my favorite clients. She was so scared but so determined to protect her baby. She reminded me of myself when I first reached out for help. Carmen is my roommate's cousin, Amanda explained. When she graduated from the foundation's job training program, she told Maria that the volunteer who helped her most was a nurse named Sarah, who understood exactly what she was going through because she had walked the same path. The room fell silent as the implications of this connection settled over us. Sarah had been helping other women while my family supported the foundation that had helped Sarah, creating an unbroken circle of healing and hope. How many women like Carmen have you worked with? Patricia asked. Dozens, Sarah replied. Maybe more. I try not to think of them as clients or cases, but as sisters who need someone to believe in their strength until they can believe in it themselves. Patricia stood up abruptly, walking to the fireplace where family photographs lined the mantel. She picked up a recent picture of the foundation's board of directors and brought it back to Sarah. "Do you recognize anyone in this photograph?" she asked. Sarah studied the image carefully, her finger stopping on one figure. "That is Mrs. Williams, the board member, who approved my scholarship application. She was so kind during my interview, and she seemed to really understand what I had been through." Patricia smiled through her tears. "Mrs. Williams is my maiden name. I have been working with the foundation under that identity to maintain some privacy while staying connected to Julia's legacy." Sarah's mouth fell open in shock. "You are Patricia Williams. You are the woman who believed in me when I could barely believe in myself." "I am the woman who failed my sister, but refused to fail the women who came after her," Patricia replied, "including you and including my granddaughter or grandson." Sarah suddenly stood up, crossing the room to embrace Patricia with surprising fierceness. "You saved my life," she whispered against my mother's shoulder. "Your foundation gave me the courage to leave Jake the resources to go back to school and the support system I needed to heal." Patricia held Sarah tightly, both women crying openly. "You saved my family's soul," she replied. "You showed me that Julia's death was not meaningless, that her legacy could create life instead of just preserving memory." David cleared his throat, drawing our attention to another document on the coffee table. "There is something else we need to share with you, Sarah. Something about your future with our family." Sarah returned to her seat, wiping her eyes with the tissue Amanda offered. "The foundation that helped you rebuild your life is about to become your inheritance," David explained. "We have restructured our family trust to create a perpetual endowment for domestic violence prevention and survivor services. When Preston inherits, he will not just receive money," Patricia added. "He will receive the responsibility for continuing Julia's work on a much larger scale." Sarah looked back and forth between my parents with amazement. "You want me to help run the foundation that saved my life?" "We want you to help expand it," Patricia corrected. "Your master's thesis about intervention programs for pregnant women in crisis could become the foundation's next major initiative. We want you to have the resources to save other women the way the foundation saved you," David added. "And we want our grandchild to grow up knowing that their family's legacy is protecting people who need help." Sarah placed her hand over her stomach, tears streaming down her face. "I came here today hoping you would accept me and the baby. I never imagined you would offer us the chance to continue something so meaningful. You are not just joining our family," Amanda said, smiling through her own tears. "You are completing it. You are the bridge between Julia's tragedy and our family's redemption." Patricia picked up Julia's journal from the coffee table, opening it to a page near the end. "Would you mind if I read you something Julia wrote just before she died?" Sarah nodded, gripping my hand tightly. "I pray that someday other young women will find the courage I could not find, the support I could not access, and the love I was denied. I pray that my baby's short life will somehow create space for other children to grow up safely. I pray that families will choose compassion over pride, love over control, and that no woman will ever have to face the choice I am facing alone." The room was completely silent except for the sound of quiet crying. "Julia's prayers are being answered through you," Patricia said, closing the journal gently. "Through the foundation, through your work, through the baby you are carrying, and through the family that is choosing love over fear." Sarah looked around the room at these people who had unknowingly shaped her life through their guilt and grief, their determination to transform tragedy into hope. "I would be honored to continue Julia's work," she said softly. "And I would be honored to raise Julia's nephew or niece to understand the power of choosing compassion over judgment." As the afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the photographs and documents that told the story of our interconnected lives, I realized that the terrible Christmas dinner from the night before had been necessary. Sometimes families have to break apart completely before they can come back together stronger than before. 6 months later, I stood in the maternity ward of General Hospital, watching through the viewing window as Sarah held our daughter for the first time. The baby was perfect in every way imaginable, with Sarah's green eyes and a determined expression that suggested she would be a force to be reckoned with in the world. Patricia had been with us through every moment of the labor, coaching Sarah through contractions and crying with joy when the baby finally arrived. She had attended every prenatal appointment, read every book on pregnancy and childcare, and transformed our nursery into a space filled with love and anticipation. "She is beautiful," Patricia whispered, her face pressed against the glass. "She looks exactly like Julia did as a baby." We had named our daughter Julia Patricia Hayes, honoring both the aunt who died too young and the grandmother who had learned to choose love over fear. The name felt perfect, connecting past and future in the most meaningful way possible. David appeared beside us carrying coffee for everyone and wearing the proud expression of a man who had found redemption in unexpected places. Over the past months, he had worked closely with Sarah to develop her master's thesis into a comprehensive program proposal for the foundation. "The hospital staff says we can go in now," he announced, his voice thick with emotion. We entered Sarah's room to find her sitting up in bed, our daughter nursing contentedly. The sight of 3 generations of women together filled me with overwhelming gratitude for the journey that had brought us to this moment. "How are you feeling?" I asked, kissing Sarah's forehead and stroking our daughter's incredibly soft hair. "Like the luckiest woman in the world," she replied, smiling tiredly. "I have a healthy daughter, a loving partner, and the most amazing extended family anyone could ask for." Amanda burst through the door at that moment, carrying a huge bouquet of flowers and barely containing her excitement. "I had to see my niece," she exclaimed, immediately going to the rocking chair beside Sarah's bed. Behind Amanda came Carlos, her fiancé, carrying a gift bag and wearing the gentle smile that had won over our entire family. His work with the Foundation's self-defense program had proven invaluable, and his genuine care for the women and children they served had made him an essential part of our mission. "Maria sends her congratulations," Carlos said, referring to the Foundation's director. "She wanted to make sure you know that your maternity leave can be as long as you need. The new intervention program can wait until you are ready to implement it." Sarah had been promoted to program coordinator at the Julia Morrison Foundation during her 2nd trimester, taking over the development of services for pregnant women in crisis situations. Her combination of personal experience and professional training made her uniquely qualified to expand their reach. "Actually," Sarah said, shifting the baby to her other arm, "I have been thinking about the program during these quiet nursing sessions. I have some ideas about how we can integrate prenatal care with emotional support services." Patricia laughed, shaking her head in amazement. "You gave birth 3 hours ago and you are already planning the next phase of foundation expansion." "I'm thinking about all the women like me who are terrified about bringing children into dangerous situations," Sarah explained. "If we can provide comprehensive support during pregnancy, we might be able to help them leave before their children are born into abuse." David pulled out his ever-present notebook, already jotting down Sarah's ideas for future development. His transformation from a man paralyzed by guilt into an active advocate for change had been remarkable to witness. "We could partner with obstetrics practices in underserved areas," he suggested, "provide funding for extended appointments that allow doctors to screen for domestic violence alongside routine prenatal care. And we could offer child care during court proceedings for women filing restraining orders," Amanda added. "I have been researching the legal barriers that prevent women from leaving abusive relationships, and lack of support during court appearances is a major obstacle. I watched my family planning ways to expand their mission of helping vulnerable women and children, and felt overwhelming pride in who they had all become. The people who had once been willing to cut me off for loving the wrong woman were now dedicating their lives to supporting other women in similar situations. A soft knock on the door interrupted our planning session. A nurse entered carrying a large flower arrangement and a card. "This just arrived for the Hayes family," she said, setting the flowers on the window ledge. Patricia opened the card and began reading aloud. "Congratulations on the birth of Julia Patricia Hayes. Your family's support helped me escape an abusive relationship 2 years ago, complete my education, and build a safe life for my children. Today I graduated from law school and will begin work as a family attorney specializing in domestic violence cases. Julia's legacy lives on through each woman your foundation helps find her strength. With gratitude, Carmen Rodriguez, J.D." Sarah began crying again, overwhelmed by the reminder that their work had impacts far beyond what they could see directly. "Carmen was one of my first clients when I started volunteering," she said through her tears. "She was so scared but so determined to protect her 2-year-old daughter. Now she is going to protect other mothers and children as a lawyer. That is the power of what you all have built," I said, looking around the room at my expanded family. "Not just helping individual women, but creating a network of survivors who go on to help others." David closed his notebook and moved to the window, looking out at the city where countless families were facing their own struggles. "Julia's death created a ripple effect of healing that has touched hundreds of lives," he said quietly. "But Sarah's survival has created something even more powerful, a model for how families can choose love over fear, support over abandonment." Patricia sat down in the chair beside Sarah's bed, reaching out to touch her granddaughter's tiny hand. "I spent 25 years trying to honor Julia's memory through charitable work," she said. "But this baby, this family we have built together, is the real monument to her life." "What do you mean?" Amanda asked. "Julia died because her family chose pride over compassion, control over trust," Patricia explained. "But Julia Patricia will grow up knowing that her family chooses love over fear, that we support each other's dreams instead of trying to control them." Sarah shifted the baby so everyone could see her more clearly. "I want her to grow up knowing that she comes from a family that turns pain into purpose," she said. "That we do not let tragedy define us, but transform it into something that helps other people heal." As evening approached and visiting hours drew to a close, our family gathered around Sarah's hospital bed for one final moment together before the new parents needed rest. "Before everyone goes," David said, reaching into his briefcase for a manila envelope, "there is something we need to make official." He produced a legal document titled Julia Patricia Hayes Educational Trust Fund and placed it on the bedside table. "This establishes a college fund for Julia Patricia that will be funded by proceeds from the foundation's expanded programs," he explained. "But more than that, it creates a scholarship program for children of domestic violence survivors who want to pursue careers in social work, law, medicine, or education. You are ensuring that the next generation has the tools they need to continue this work," Sarah said, understanding the long-term vision they were creating. "We are ensuring that Julia's legacy extends far beyond our family," Patricia corrected. "Every child who receives a scholarship in Julia Patricia's name will be equipped to help other families facing crisis." I looked down at my sleeping daughter, this tiny person who represented so much hope and healing for people she would never meet. She would grow up knowing that she was born into a family that believes in second chances, that fights for the vulnerable, and that turns their worst moments into opportunities to help others. "There is one more thing," Sarah said, reaching for the small journal she had been keeping throughout her pregnancy. "I have been writing letters to Julia Patricia just like your sister Julia wrote to her unborn child. But I also want to write a letter to Julia thanking her for the sacrifice that made our family possible." She opened the journal to a page near the back and began reading, "Dear Julia, I never had the chance to meet you, but your story saved my life and the life of your niece. Your death was a tragedy, but it was not meaningless. Through the foundation your family created in your memory, hundreds of women have found the courage to leave dangerous situations and build better lives for themselves and their children. Your nephew Preston has become the kind of man who fights for justice and protects the vulnerable. Your sister Patricia has transformed her grief into a force for good that has changed countless lives. Your brother-in-law David has dedicated his retirement to ensuring that no woman faces the choice you faced alone. Your niece Julia Patricia will grow up in a family that chooses love over control, support over abandonment. She will know that she carries your name and your legacy of hope. Thank you for the sacrifice that made all of this love possible. There was not a dry eye in the room as Sarah finished reading. The circle of pain and redemption that had brought us together felt complete in that moment, but also ready to expand outward to touch more lives. As our family prepared to leave Sarah and me alone with our daughter for the first time, Patricia paused at the door. "Preston," she said, "do you remember what you said to me that Christmas night? You said I had to choose between being the woman who honors Julia's memory by supporting love and family, or the woman who repeats the mistakes that killed her sister." "I remember. I chose love," she said simply, "and it has given me everything I thought I had lost." After everyone left, Sarah and I sat quietly in the darkened hospital room, watching our daughter sleep and marveling at the journey that had brought us to this perfect moment. "Do you ever think about how different this could have been?" Sarah asked softly. "You mean if my family had stuck with their original reaction?" "I mean, if I'd been too scared to trust them with a second chance," she said. "If I had let their initial rejection convince me that we would never be accepted." I thought about that possibility, about how we might have raised Julia Patricia without the support and love of her grandparents, without the foundation's resources, without Amanda's friendship or David's wisdom. I think about it sometimes, I admitted. But then I remember something you told me early in our relationship. You said that healing requires both courage from the wounded and compassion from the healers. My family had to find their compassion, but you had to find the courage to let them try again. And now Julia Patricia gets to grow up in a family that knows how to choose love even when it is difficult, Sarah said, stroking our daughter's cheek. She gets to grow up knowing that her family's legacy is turning broken places into sources of strength for other people. As dawn broke over the city, painting the hospital room in soft golden light, I reflected on how much had changed since that terrible Christmas dinner 6 months ago. The family that had been willing to disown me for loving Sarah had become the foundation's greatest champions. The woman they had called a gold digger had become their successor in honoring Julia's memory. The baby they had called illegitimate had become the symbol of their redemption. Most importantly, we had all learned that love is not about controlling other people's choices, but about supporting them as they build the lives they need to be happy and healthy. We had learned that family is not just about blood relationships, but about choosing to show up for each other through difficult times and transformations. Julia Patricia stirred in her sleep, making the soft sounds that would become familiar to us over the coming months and years. Looking at her peaceful face, I made a silent promise that she would grow up knowing she was wanted, supported, and celebrated. She would never doubt her place in our family or her worth as a human being. But more than that, she would grow up understanding that her comfortable, secure life was built on a foundation of service to others. She would learn early that privilege comes with responsibility, that healing comes through helping others heal, and that love is something you practice rather than something you simply feel. The foundation that had saved Sarah's life would become Julia Patricia's inheritance, but not just as financial security. It would be her training ground for becoming the kind of person who sees suffering and responds with compassion, who recognizes injustice and works for change. As I watch my daughter sleep in her mother's arms, surrounded by the love of a family that had learned to choose hope over fear, I felt profound gratitude for the journey that had brought us all together. The worst night of my life had become the catalyst for the most beautiful transformation I could have imagined. Sometimes the greatest gifts come wrapped in the most painful packages. Sometimes families have to break completely apart before they can come back together stronger than before. Sometimes the people who hurt us the most are the ones who need our forgiveness in order to become who they are meant to be. Our story began with rejection and cruelty, but it ends with acceptance and love. It began with a family torn apart by fear and pride, but it ends with a family united by purpose and compassion. It began with the tragedy of Julia's death, but it ends with the hope of Julia Patricia's life. If you have ever felt rejected by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally, I want you to know that sometimes that rejection is about their fears rather than your worth. If you have ever had to choose between love and family approval, I want you to know that real family will eventually choose love too, even if it takes them time to get there. Most importantly, if you have ever wondered whether your pain can be transformed into something meaningful, I want you to tell you that it can. The worst things that happen to us can become the foundation for the best things we do for others. Julia's death became the source of life for hundreds of women. Sarah's trauma became the source of healing for countless families. My family's breakdown became the source of our greatest strength. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to choose between love and family expectations? Have you ever seen a family transform from rejection to acceptance? What would you do if you discovered that the person you were rejecting was actually the key to healing your family's deepest wounds? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your story might be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to hear more stories about families who find their way back to love. Share this with someone who needs to know that redemption is always possible, even in the most broken situations. Thank you for allowing me to share Julia Patricia's story with you. May your own families choose love over fear, compassion over control, and hope over despair. Until next time, remember that every ending can become a new beginning if we have the courage to turn our pain into purpose.